Two colossal palaces have long competed for the title of America's most opulent private estate. Biltmore, nestled in the mountains of Asheville, North Carolina, was completed in 1895 at a cost equivalent to $500 million today. Mar-a-Lago, gleaming on the shores of Palm Beach, Florida, rose in 1927 as a fantasy of Spanish tiles and Venetian splendor. The first was the vision of George Washington Vanderbilt II, youngest heir to America's greatest railroad fortune. The second belonged to Marjorie Merriweather Post, the serial heiress whose breakfast empire made her one of the wealthiest women in the nation. Both estates have survived economic collapse, world wars, and the deaths of their visionary founders. Both have been transformed in ways their creators never imagined. Today we weigh these two monuments against each other to answer a deceptively simple question: which American empire was truly more powerful? In the Gilded Age of the 1880s and 1890s, America witnessed the rise of fortunes so vast they rivaled the treasuries of European nations. At the apex of this new aristocracy stood the Vanderbilt family, whose railroad empire had generated wealth beyond ordinary comprehension. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt had built his dynasty from nothing, starting with a single ferry boat in New York Harbor. Born in 17 hours in Chackand or in 1794 to a poor Staten Island farmer, the Commodore possessed an almost supernatural instinct for transportation and commerce. By his 30th birthday, he controlled a fleet of steamships that dominated traffic along the eastern seaboard. By his 50th, he had turned his attention to railroads, recognizing that iron rails would soon supersede waterways as America's commercial arteries. The Commodore's methods were ruthless, and his competitors learned to fear him. He bought struggling rail lines, consolidated them into efficient networks, and crushed anyone who stood in his path. When he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had amassed approximately $100 million, a sum equivalent to well over $2 billion in today's currency. This made him the richest American who had ever lived up to that point. He left the bulk of his fortune to his son William Henry, who proved equally adept at multiplication. Within 8 years, William Henry had doubled the family wealth to $200 million through shrewd management of the railroad interests. The Vanderbilt children and grandchildren proceeded to spend this fortune with legendary abandon. They constructed palatial homes along Fifth Avenue that announced their status to all of Manhattan. The Petit Chateau at 1660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882, introduced French Renaissance architecture to American high society. The Triple Palace complex nearby housed 3 branches of the family in interconnected splendor. In Newport, Rhode Island, the Vanderbilts erected summer cottages that were mansions in all but name. The Breakers, Marble House, and Rough Point became monuments to the family's insatiable appetite for grandeur. Yet among the Vanderbilt heirs, one stood apart from his siblings in temperament and ambition. George Washington Vanderbilt II, born on November 14, 1862, arrived as the youngest of William Henry's 8 children. From his earliest years, George displayed a disposition fundamentally bristling different from his brothers Cornelius II and William Kissam. Where they gravitated toward business ledgers and stock tickers, George preferred the company of books, art, and scholarly pursuits. His childhood was marked by frequent illness, which confined him to bed for long stretches and cultivated in him a reflective, introspective nature. George's education reflected his intellectual appetites. He studied under private tutors who recognized his exceptional linguistic abilities. By his teenage years, he had achieved fluency in 8 languages, including Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. He read voraciously across every discipline, accumulating a personal library that would eventually number over 23,000 volumes. His interests ranged from agriculture to philosophy, from art history to the emerging science of forestry. His father, William Henry Vanderbilt, recognized this difference and reportedly worried about George's fitness for the cutthroat world of American commerce. Unlike his siblings, George showed little interest in the social competitions that consumed New York high society. He attended the required balls and dinners but derived no pleasure from them. The endless jockeying for status among the 400, as the elite social circle was known, struck him as tedious and hollow. He preferred instead to spend his evenings reading or examining artwork in the family's growing collection. His mother, Maria Louisa, understood her youngest son best and encouraged his scholarly inclinations. She recognized that George would find his own path, different from but no less significant than his brother's pursuits. George's education took him across Europe multiple times during his formative years. These grand tours were common among wealthy American families, but George approached them with uncommon seriousness. He wandered through the galleries of Paris, spending hours before individual paintings that other tourists passed in minutes. He studied the architecture of Rome, sketching columns and facades in notebooks he filled with meticulous observations. The great country estates of England impressed him with their integration of house, garden, and productive landscape. But it was the French chateaux of the Loire Valley that captured his imagination most completely. These Renaissance masterpieces represented something America lacked entirely. Chateau de Blois, with its famous spiral staircase, had witnessed centuries of French royal history. Chenonceau spanned the river Cher with an elegance that seemed to defy gravity itself. Chambord's roofline bristled with towers and chimneys like a fairy tale illustration come to life. George recognized in these buildings not merely residences but cultural institutions that had shaped French civilization across generations. They were repositories of art, libraries of knowledge, and models of land stewardship, all unified under single roofs. America, George concluded, deserved something similar. The young heir began to dream of creating such a monument on American soil. This would not be merely another Vanderbilt mansion competing for attention on Fifth Avenue or Bellevue Avenue. George envisioned a grand estate that would serve as a cultural institution for generations to come. It would house his growing art collection and library. It would demonstrate progressive agricultural and forestry techniques. It would employ hundreds of local workers and stimulate an entire regional economy. Most importantly, it would endure long after the ephemeral social triumphs of his siblings had been forgotten. The question of where to build such a monument consumed George's imagination throughout his 20s. New York was too crowded, too competitive, too much a stage for the social theater he despised. Newport offered seaside beauty but had already been claimed by his brothers and their rivals. George wanted something different, a place where he could create an entirely new world according to his own vision. He considered locations across the country, from the Hudson Valley to the mountains of California. None satisfied his exacting requirements until fate intervened through family circumstance. In 1888, George accompanied his mother, Maria Louisa, to Asheville, North Carolina. She suffered from malaria, and her doctors had recommended the mountain air for recuperation. The town of Asheville sat at an elevation of over 2,000 feet in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where cool breezes and low humidity provided relief from the diseases that plagued coastal lowlands. George had expected to find a provincial backwater barely worth his attention. Instead, he discovered a landscape of extraordinary beauty that answered every requirement of his vision. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched in endless blue-green waves toward every horizon. Morning mists rose from hidden valleys like incense from nature's cathedral. The climate was temperate year-round, neither too hot in summer nor too cold in winter. Most importantly, vast tracts of land were available at prices that would have seemed impossibly cheap in the Northeast. George could acquire an entire kingdom here for what a single city lot cost in Manhattan. The remoteness that might have deterred his brothers only enhanced the appeal. Here he could build something entirely his own, unconstrained by neighbors or convention. George began purchasing property with the systematic determination of a man possessed by a singular vision. Working through agents to avoid inflating prices, he accumulated farm after farm, woodlot after woodlot. Local families who had worked the same land for generations suddenly found themselves with offers they could not refuse. By the time his acquisitions were complete, George Vanderbilt owned approximately 125,000 acres of western North Carolina. This landholding exceeded the total area of Washington, D.C., and represented the largest privately owned tract in the eastern United States. The scale was almost incomprehensible to those who witnessed it. The locals watched with a mixture of awe and skepticism as this soft-spoken New Yorker accumulated their hills and valleys. What could any man possibly want with so much wilderness? The answer would soon rise from the mist-shrouded mountains. George envisioned not just a house, but an entire self-sustaining estate modeled on the great manorial traditions of Europe. There would be formal gardens rivaling Versailles. There would be managed forests demonstrating the latest scientific techniques. And at the center would stand a chateau, worthy of French nobility, the largest private home America had ever seen. To realize this dream, George would need the finest architect in America. He would need Richard Morris Hunt, the Dean of American Architecture and the only man in the country trained at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt had already designed mansions for George's brothers at Newport. He understood the Vanderbilt appetite for grandeur. The partnership between the bookish heir and the celebrated architect would produce something unprecedented in the American landscape. But George Vanderbilt was not the only American dreamer whose fortune would seek immortality in stone and mortar. Half a century later, another vision would take shape under an entirely different constellation of wealth on the sun-drenched shores of Palm Beach, Florida. In the Roaring '20s, while George Vanderbilt's chateau stood as a monument to Gilded Age restraint, a different kind of American fortune was seeking its own expression in stone. The source of this new wealth was not railroads or steel, but something far more humble. It was breakfast cereal. Charles William Post had built an empire on the simple proposition that Americans needed a better way to start their mornings. From his sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, he had launched products that would transform the nation's eating habits forever. Post had arrived in Battle Creek in 1891 as a broken man. He suffered from neurasthenia, a nervous condition that left him bedridden and desperate for any cure. The Kellogg Brothers Sanitarium offered dietary treatments that emphasized whole grains and abstinence from stimulants. Post recovered his health, but departed with something more valuable than restored vigor. He had observed the commercial potential of the health food movement. If people would pay to eat bland cereals in a medical setting, they would surely pay to eat improved versions at home. In 1895, Post launched Postum, a coffee substitute made from roasted wheat and molasses. The product capitalized on growing anxiety about caffeine's effects on the nervous system. Post's genius lay not in the product itself, but in his marketing. He purchased newspaper advertisements at an unprecedented scale, warning readers of the dangers lurking in their coffee cups. "Lost eyesight through coffee drinking," screamed one headline. "It's the coffee," declared another, blaming the beverage for everything from heart palpitations to divorce. The American public responded with enthusiasm that exceeded Post's wildest projections. Postum sales soared, and Post plowed the profits into new product development. In 1897, he introduced Grape Nuts, a crunchy cereal whose name bore no relation to its ingredients of wheat and barley. The following year brought Post Toasties, a cornflake designed to compete directly with the Kellogg Brothers' similar product. Each launch was accompanied by advertising campaigns that blanketed newspapers from coast to coast. By 1901, Post's company was generating profits of over $1 million annually. Charles Post did not live to see his empire reach its zenith. He suffered from chronic stomach ailments that no breakfast cereal could cure. Depression darkened his later years, and on May 9, 1914, he took his own life at his Santa Barbara estate. He was 59 years old. The fortune he left behind was valued at approximately $20 million, equivalent to over $500 million in today's currency. His only child and heir was a 27-year-old woman named Marjorie Merriweather Post. Marjorie had been groomed for responsibility from an early age. Her father had brought her into board meetings as a teenager, teaching her to read balance sheets and evaluate business proposals. She possessed her father's commercial instincts combined with a social grace he had never achieved. At the time of his death, she had already been married for 9 years to Edward Bennett Close, a New York financier. The marriage had produced 2 daughters, but little happiness. Marjorie found herself wealthy beyond imagination, yet unfulfilled in her personal life. She threw herself into managing the Post cereal company with determination that surprised the male executives who expected a figurehead. Marjorie expanded the product line and modernized manufacturing facilities across Battle Creek. She approved advertising campaigns and reviewed quarterly reports with the attention of a seasoned industrialist. The company thrived under her ownership, growing larger and more profitable with each passing year. In 1922, she orchestrated a merger with several other food companies to create the Postum Cereal Company, a conglomerate that would eventually become General Foods. Marjorie's first marriage ended in divorce in 1919. Her second marriage, to Edward Francis Hutton in 1920, would prove more consequential for our story. E.F. Hutton was a Wall Street financier whose brokerage bore his name. Together, the couple commanded a fortune that ranked among the largest in America. They maintained apartments in New York, a camp in the Adirondacks, and a yacht large enough to carry a crew of 72. Yet Marjorie dreamed of something more permanent than these temporary addresses. Palm Beach, Florida, had emerged in the 1920s as the winter playground for America's ultra-wealthy. Henry Flagler's railroad had opened the remote barrier island to development in the 1890s. By the time Marjorie arrived, the town had blossomed into an exclusive enclave of Mediterranean-style mansions and private clubs. Worth Avenue offered shopping to rival Fifth Avenue. The Everglades Club provided social connection for those fortunate enough to secure membership. The constant sunshine and gentle breezes offered respite from northern winters that seemed to grow colder with each passing year. Marjorie fell in love with Palm Beach immediately. The climate suited her health, and the social scene suited her temperament. She began searching for property with the same systematic approach she applied to business acquisitions. Most available parcels offered either ocean frontage or lake frontage. Marjorie wanted both. In 1924, she identified a 17-acre parcel that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth. It was the only property on the island that could offer such dual access. She purchased it without hesitation. The name she chose for her future estate reflected this unique geography. Mar-a-Lago means sea to lake in Spanish. The name also carried an exotic elegance that appealed to Marjorie's romantic sensibilities. She envisioned something more than a typical Palm Beach mansion. She wanted to create a palace worthy of European royalty, a residence so magnificent that it might one day serve national purposes. According to family accounts, Marjorie stated explicitly that she hoped her home would become a winter White House for American presidents. This prophecy would take nearly a century to fulfill, and in ways she could never have imagined. But first, Marjorie needed to find architects capable of translating her grandiose vision into reality. She required designers who understood both the Spanish colonial traditions of Florida and the theatrical demands of high society entertaining. The estate, she imagined, would need to function as private residence, entertainment venue, and potential diplomatic setting all at once. It was an extraordinary brief that demanded extraordinary talent. Marjorie found her architects in the partnership of Marion Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban. Wyeth was already established as Palm Beach's most sought-after residential designer. He had created homes for the Stotesburys, the Phippses, and other pillars of the winter colony. His work combined classical proportions with tropical practicality, understanding that Florida's climate demanded different solutions than European models. Urban brought an entirely different perspective. He was a Viennese set designer who had created fantastical worlds for the Ziegfeld Follies and the Metropolitan Opera. His theatrical sensibility would infuse Mar-a-Lago with drama that conventional architects could never achieve. The collaboration began in 1924 with planning sessions that stretched over many months. Marjorie proved as demanding a client as any architect could face. She reviewed every sketch and questioned every material selection. She traveled to Europe to study palaces and collect decorative elements for her future home. From Spain, she purchased antique tiles by the thousands. From Italy, she acquired Dorian stone from historic quarries near Genoa. No expense was spared, and no detail overlooked in the pursuit of her vision. 2 visions, 2 fortunes, 2 parcels of American earth now awaited transformation. In the mountains of North Carolina, George Vanderbilt's dream was already taking physical form. On the shores of Palm Beach, Marjorie Post's fantasy remained on paper, though not for long. Both would require years of construction and armies of craftsmen. Both would consume fortunes that could have funded small nations. And both would ultimately raise the same question that drives our inquiry today. Now the architects would step forward, and stone would begin to rise. In the misty foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, construction began in 1889 on what would become America's most ambitious private residence. George Vanderbilt had secured the services of Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect of the Gilded Age. Hunt was the first American to attend the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where he had absorbed the classical traditions that would define his entire career. He had already designed palatial homes for George's brothers at Newport, including the Breakers for Cornelius II and Marble House for William Kissam. Those commissions had tested Hunt's abilities and expanded his reputation. Now he faced the greatest challenge of his distinguished career. Hunt arrived in Asheville to survey the site in person during the summer of 1889. He spent days walking the ridges and valleys that George had acquired, studying the play of light across the mountain landscape. The architect immediately understood that conventional approaches would not suffice for this commission. The scale of the property demanded something equally grand in architectural response. Hunt began sketching ideas that drew upon his years of study in France. The chateau of the Loire Valley had impressed him as a young student, and now he saw an opportunity to reinterpret their grandeur for an American setting. The design that emerged from Hunt's drafting tables drew inspiration from the great chateau of the French Renaissance. Blois provided the model for the iconic spiral staircase that would grace Biltmore's entrance hall. This open stonework staircase would rise 4 stories through the heart of the house, allowing light to cascade through its delicate tracery. Chenonceau influenced the long gallery that would display George's growing art collection. The gallery stretched 90 feet in length and featured a barrel-vaulted ceiling that directed the eye toward distant mountain views through tall windows. Chambord's exuberant roofline inspired the forest of chimneys and dormers that would crown the finished structure. Yet Hunt did not merely copy European models for his American client. He adapted them to American scale and American purposes, creating something that honored tradition while asserting New World ambition. The house would incorporate modern conveniences that European chateaux could never have imagined. It would function as a working estate rather than a museum piece. Hunt understood that George Vanderbilt wanted a home, not merely a monument. Every design decision balanced aesthetic grandeur against practical livability. The statistics of Biltmore's construction stagger the imagination even today. The finished house would contain 178,926 square feet of floor space, making it the largest private home in American history. That record stands unchallenged more than a century later. Within its walls would be arranged 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms. 65 fireplaces would warm the vast spaces during mountain winters when temperatures dropped below freezing. The basement alone covered an acre and contained kitchens, laundries, and servant quarters sufficient for a small hotel. The project would require 6 years of continuous construction and employ over 1,000 workers at its peak. George Vanderbilt essentially built a small city to construct his house. A private railroad spur was extended solely to transport materials to the remote site. Limestone arrived from Indiana quarries in railway cars that made the journey hundreds of times. Marble came from Italy packed in wooden crates. Roof slate crossed the Atlantic from English quarries renowned for durability. Skilled craftsmen were recruited from across America and Europe, lured by wages that exceeded prevailing rates. Hunt insisted on the finest materials available regardless of cost. The exterior walls rose in Indiana limestone, its pale cream surface gleaming against the dark forests surrounding the construction site. Each block was cut to precise specifications and fitted by masons who had trained in European cathedral workshops. The roof was sheathed in slate that would last centuries without repair. Interior woodwork featured oak from American forests, carved by craftsmen trained in traditional European workshops. The entrance hall alone required enough marble to floor a small church, its checkerboard pattern establishing the grandeur that would characterize every space. George Vanderbilt approved every expenditure without complaint. He reviewed invoices personally and visited the construction site regularly to monitor progress. He wanted perfection and was willing to pay whatever perfection cost. When Hunt suggested a particular detail might be simplified to reduce expense, George invariably chose the more elaborate option. Cost was never discussed as a limiting factor. The Vanderbilt fortune seemed inexhaustible, and George intended to spend as much of his share as necessary to realize his vision. The technological innovations incorporated into Biltmore were as impressive as its architectural grandeur. George insisted on electric lighting throughout the residence, while in teens, making Biltmore one of the first homes in America to be fully electrified. Thomas Edison's company designed and installed the system, running miles of wire through walls and ceilings. Central heating distributed warmth through ductwork hidden within the massive walls. The system was so effective that even the most distant rooms remained comfortable during the harshest mountain winters. Indoor plumbing provided hot and cold running water to every bathroom. An indoor swimming pool offered year-round recreation, regardless of weather. The pool room featured underwater lighting and changing facilities that rivaled the finest athletic clubs. A bowling alley in the basement provided entertainment for guests who tired of outdoor pursuits. Refrigeration units preserved food in quantities sufficient for elaborate house parties lasting weeks. The kitchen equipment represented the cutting edge of culinary technology, enabling a staff of French-trained chefs to prepare meals worthy of European royalty. George's vision extended far beyond the house itself. He engaged Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had created Central Park, to design the grounds. Olmsted was 66 years old and in failing health when he accepted the commission. His eyesight was failing and his memory occasionally faltered. Yet he recognized Biltmore as the capstone of his legendary career. He poured his remaining energy into creating a landscape plan of unprecedented ambition. Olmsted's design called for a 3-mile approach road that would wind through carefully managed forest before revealing the chateau in a dramatic crescendo. The visitor would pass through increasingly refined landscapes, building anticipation for the climactic moment when the house appeared. The immediate gardens near the house would feature formal designs in the French manner, with geometrically trimmed hedges and symmetrical flower beds. Beyond them, the landscape would gradually transition to managed woodland and productive farmland in the English pastoral tradition. Olmsted's design required moving mountains of earth and planting thousands of trees and shrubs. A 4-acre walled garden would supply vegetables and cut flowers for the house throughout the year. An elaborate conservatory would nurture exotic plants from around the world, its glass roof gleaming in the mountain sunlight. The grounds would include a base pond, stocked for fishing and meadows maintained for horseback riding. Italian-style pergolas would provide shaded walkways through the formal gardens. The total landscaped area near the house covered approximately 250 acres, though the full estate extended across 125,000 acres. The construction process transformed the local economy of western North Carolina. Workers flooded into Asheville seeking employment on the great project. Boarding houses sprang up to accommodate them. Merchants prospered, supplying their needs. A woodworking shop established to produce Biltmore's interior details evolved into a permanent local industry that continues operating today. George Vanderbilt became the region's largest employer and most significant economic force. His progressive attitudes toward labor relations set standards that local businesses emulated. George also brought scientific forestry to America through his management of Biltmore's vast woodland holdings. He hired Gifford Pinchot, a young Yale graduate who had studied forestry in Europe, to manage the estate's forests. Pinchot implemented sustainable harvesting practices that were virtually unknown in America. He established the Biltmore Forest School, the first institution in America dedicated to training professional foresters. Graduates of this school would go on to establish the United States Forest Service and shape conservation policy for generations. By 1895, the main house neared completion. The final cost approached $6 million for the house alone, equivalent to approximately $180 million today. When land acquisition, landscaping, and furnishing costs were included, total investment exceeded $10 million. That figure translates to roughly $300 million in modern currency. It was the most expensive private residence ever constructed in America. George Vanderbilt chose Christmas Eve 1895 for Biltmore's grand opening celebration. Family and friends arrived by private train to find the chateau ablaze with electric light against the winter darkness. A 40-foot Christmas tree dominated the entrance hall. The banquet table groaned under delicacies prepared by French chefs. Guests wandered through rooms filled with Renaissance paintings and medieval tapestries. They marveled at the library's 23,000 volumes arranged on shelves, reaching toward a ceiling painted with clouds. Richard Morris Hunt did not live to see that Christmas celebration. He had died on July 31, 1895, just months before the house's completion. George Vanderbilt mourned his collaborator sincerely. Together they had created something unprecedented. But on the opposite coast, a different vision was taking shape under Florida sunshine. While Biltmore represented European tradition translated to American soil, Mar-a-Lago would pursue an altogether different architectural fantasy. Under the Florida sun, where palm fronds swayed in Atlantic breezes, construction began on Mar-a-Lago in 1924. Marion Sims Wyeth had already established himself as Palm Beach's preeminent residential architect. His portfolio included homes for the Stotesburys, the Phippsys, and other pillars of the winter colony. Wyeth understood the unique demands of Florida construction. He knew how to balance Mediterranean grandeur against tropical humidity and hurricane threats. But Marjorie Merriweather Post wanted something beyond conventional Palm Beach elegance. She wanted theater. She wanted fantasy. She wanted a palace that would transport guests to another world entirely. To achieve this vision, Wyeth partnered with Joseph Urban, a collaborator whose background could not have differed more dramatically from his own. Urban was Viennese by birth and theatrical by temperament. He had designed sets for the Ziegfeld Follies that transformed Broadway stages into dreamscapes of color and light. He had created productions for the Metropolitan Opera that critics hailed as revolutionary. His approach to architecture treated buildings as stages where life itself became performance. Marjorie recognized in Urban a kindred spirit who shared her appetite for spectacle. The partnership proved extraordinarily productive despite the architect's contrasting sensibilities. Wyeth provided structural discipline and practical expertise in Florida construction. Urban contributed theatrical imagination and a bold approach to color and ornament. Their collaboration produced designs that neither could have achieved alone. The blueprints that emerged promised a fusion of Spanish, Venetian, Portuguese, and Moorish influences. No single historical style would dominate. Instead, Mar-a-Lago would create its own vocabulary of grandeur. Construction proceeded through 1924 and into the following years, with intensity matching Biltmore's great project 3 decades earlier. Marjorie Post Perpatience proved as demanding a client as George Vanderbilt had been. She reviewed every material sample and questioned every design decision. When contractors proposed shortcuts, she refused them without hesitation. The estate rising on her 17 acres would meet her exacting standards, or it would not be built at all. Cost was no object. Quality was everything. The craftsmen Marjorie recruited came from across the globe. Stone carvers arrived from Italy, bringing centuries of tradition in their skilled hands. Tile workers came from Spain and Portugal, carrying techniques passed down through generations. Iron workers fashioned gates and railings with the artistry of medieval guilds. Local Florida workers provided labor for the heavy construction. At peak activity, hundreds of men worked simultaneously across the sprawling site. The materials that arrived at Mar-a-Lago read like an inventory of Mediterranean treasures. Dorian stone came from quarries near Genoa that had supplied Italian palaces for centuries. This creamy stone would face the exterior walls, its surface warm against the Florida sunshine. Roof tiles arrived from barrel-vaulted kilns in Spain, each one handmade according to ancient methods. The signature feature of the construction was the 36,000 antique Spanish tiles that Marjorie had collected during her European travels. Some dated to the 15th century. Others had adorned palaces demolished to make way for modern development. These tiles would cover walls, floors, ceilings, and decorative surfaces throughout the house. Each was unique, bearing patterns and glazes that reflected individual artisans' hands across 5 centuries of Spanish craftsmanship. Installing them required specialists who understood both their fragility and their proper placement. Marjorie supervised this work personally, selecting which tiles would occupy which positions. The process consumed months, but produced effects that no modern manufacturing could replicate. The main house sprawled across the property with theatrical exuberance. The design incorporated 126 rooms arranged around courtyards and galleries. 58 bedrooms would accommodate the vast house parties Marjorie planned to host. 33 bathrooms provided modern convenience within the historic aesthetic. 12 fireplaces offered warmth on the rare, cold Florida evenings. The square footage totaled approximately 62,500 feet, smaller than Biltmore but immense by any normal standard. The signature architectural feature was a 75-foot tower that rose above the roofline like a Venetian campanile. This tower announced Mar-a-Lago's presence to anyone approaching by land or sea. Its silhouette became the estate's visual identity, recognizable across the Palm Beach landscape. From its upper windows, observers could survey the entire property, from ocean to lake. Marjorie had created a landmark as distinctive as any lighthouse. Interior spaces showcased Joseph Urban's theatrical genius at every turn. The living room ceiling soared to 42 feet, covered entirely in gold leaf that caught and reflected the Florida sunlight. This was not mere gilding, but actual gold applied by craftsmen using techniques perfected in European cathedrals. The effect was overwhelming. Visitors entering this space gasped at the sheer opulence confronting their eyes. Urban had designed it to produce exactly this reaction. The dining room continued the dramatic theme with a ceiling painted to represent the sky. Clouds seemed to drift overhead as guests enjoyed their meals. The walls featured tapestries and paintings selected to complement the celestial theme above. Marjorie could seat 36 guests for formal dinners at a table that had once belonged to European nobility. The silver, crystal, and china services she acquired would have satisfied any royal household. A cloister connected the main house to secondary structures through a covered walkway lined with Spanish columns. This architectural feature provided shade during the subtropical heat while maintaining the Mediterranean aesthetic throughout the property. Guests could stroll from house to guest quarters without exposure to sun or rain. The effect was that of a private village, rather than a single residence. The grounds surrounding the house received attention equal to the structures themselves. An underground tunnel connected the main house to the beach, allowing guests to reach the ocean without crossing public roads. This tunnel remains functional today, a testament to the thoroughness of the original construction. Gardens featured tropical plantings, selected to bloom throughout the winter social season. Fountains provided cooling sounds and visual interest at key points throughout the landscape. The swimming pool became a gathering point for informal entertaining. Unlike Biltmore's indoor pool, Mar-a-Lago's pool basked in Florida sunshine, surrounded by terraces where guests could lounge between dips. The pool area could accommodate hundreds for the legendary parties Marjorie would host. Changing facilities and service buildings clustered nearby, invisible from the main entertainment spaces but readily accessible to staff. Construction stretched over 4 years, finally reaching completion in 1927. The total cost approached $7 million, equivalent to approximately $120 million in today's currency. This figure included the house itself, the extensive grounds, the furnishings and art collected from around the world, and the antique architectural elements incorporated throughout. Marjorie Post had created something without precedent in American residential architecture. The estate she unveiled to Palm Beach society represented a philosophy of living fundamentally different from Biltmore's scholarly restraint. Where George Vanderbilt had sought to transplant European tradition to American soil, Marjorie Post had created a fantasy unconstrained by historical authenticity. Mar-a-Lago did not attempt to replicate any particular European model. Instead, it combined elements from multiple traditions into something entirely new. The result was theatrical, exuberant, and unabashedly American in its appetite for spectacle. On a warm evening in 1927, Marjorie Merriweather Post opened Mar-a-Lago's doors for its inaugural celebration. The guest list represented the pinnacle of American society. Palm Beach's winter colony arrived in their finest evening wear. New York financiers mingled with Hollywood celebrities. Politicians and diplomats circulated through rooms that seemed conjured from a fairy tale. The fountains played. The gold ceilings glowed. The hostess herself presided over the scene with the confidence of a woman who had realized her grandest vision. Both estates had now risen from vision to reality. In the mountains of North Carolina, Biltmore stood as a monument to Gilded Age cultivation and European tradition. On the shores of Palm Beach, Mar-a-Lago proclaimed Jazz Age exuberance and theatrical fantasy. Both represented the pinnacle of American residential architecture in their respective eras. Both had consumed fortunes that ordinary citizens could scarcely comprehend, and both would now enter their respective golden ages, hosting the glittering worlds of high society entertaining that would define American culture for generations to come. Biltmore's golden age began with that Christmas celebration in 1895 and continued through the early years of the new century. George Vanderbilt had created not merely a residence, but a self-sustaining world unto itself. The estate functioned like a feudal manor transplanted to the American South. Hundreds of workers tended the gardens, managed the forests, operated the dairy, and maintained the vast house. George presided over this domain with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had realized his life's ambition. The house parties at Biltmore became legendary among the American aristocracy. George and his wife Edith, whom he had married in 1898, hosted gatherings that lasted weeks at a time. Guests arrived by private railcar and found themselves immersed in a world of cultivated luxury. The days offered horseback riding through the managed forests, hunting in the game preserves, and golf on the estate's private course. Evenings brought elaborate dinners in the banquet hall, followed by music and conversation in the library. The guest lists read like a registry of Gilded Age achievement. Henry James visited and found inspiration for his literary observations on American wealth. Edith Wharton came and later drew upon the experience in her own writing about high society. Politicians, diplomats, and business titans all accepted invitations to Biltmore. The remoteness that had initially seemed a disadvantage became an asset. Guests were captive to their host's hospitality, unable to dash off to competing engagements as they might in Newport or New York. George continued developing the estate throughout this period with characteristic thoroughness. The agricultural operations expanded to include prize-winning herds of cattle and hogs. The dairy produced milk and butter for the house and for sale to local markets. The winery that George established began producing wines from estate-grown grapes. Biltmore Village, the community George had built for his workers, grew into a model town with its own church, hospital, and shops. The estate became an economic engine for the entire region. The scientific forestry program under Gifford Pinchot achieved remarkable results during these years. Pinchot implemented management practices that increased the productivity of the woodlands while preserving their ecological health. The Biltmore Forest School trained young men who would carry these principles across America. When Pinchot left in 1892, Moraim Shrama females at 1895 to pursue other opportunities, George hired Carl Schenk to continue the work. Schenk proved equally dedicated to sustainable forestry and expanded the educational program significantly. Yet even as Biltmore flourished, shadows gathered on the horizon. The Vanderbilt fortune, vast as it was, could not sustain indefinite expenditure without corresponding income. The estate consumed approximately $250,000 annually just for basic maintenance. That figure equates to roughly $7 million in today's currency. The agricultural and forestry operations generated some revenue but never approached profitability. George had created a monument that demanded constant financial sacrifice. On March 6, 1914, tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington, D.C., following complications from an emergency appendectomy. He was just 51 years old. The man who had dreamed Biltmore into existence would never see his creation reach its full maturity. His body was returned to the estate and interred in the family cemetery on the grounds he had so lovingly developed. Edith Vanderbilt found herself sole steward of an enterprise that would have challenged any administrator. She was 41 years old with a 13-year-old daughter named Cornelia. The estate's debts required immediate attention. The annual operating costs showed no sign of diminishing. Edith responded with a decisiveness that surprised those who had known her primarily as a gracious hostess. Her first major decision came in 1914 when she sold 87,000 acres of the estate's forest land to the United States government. This transaction created the core of what would become Pisgah National Forest. Edith received approximately $400,000 for the land, equivalent to roughly $11 million today. The sale reduced the estate's tax burden and provided capital for ongoing operations. It also ensured that George's forestry legacy would be preserved in public hands rather than exploited by private timber interests. The remaining 8,000 acres still constituted an enormous property requiring constant management. Edith maintained the agricultural operations and continued hosting guests, though at a reduced scale from the lavish parties of George's lifetime. She remarried in 1925 to Senator Peter Gerry of Rhode Island, which required her to divide time between Biltmore and Washington. The great house stood increasingly quiet, its rooms empty more often than occupied. The Great Depression struck the already strained estate with crushing force. Wealthy Americans who might have visited Biltmore found their fortunes diminished or destroyed. Tourism, which had begun to emerge as a potential revenue source, collapsed along with the broader economy. The maintenance costs that George had absorbed without complaint now loomed as an existential threat. Something had to change if Biltmore was to survive. In 1930, Edith and Cornelia made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable during George's lifetime. They opened Biltmore House to the public, charging admission to visitors who wished to tour the great rooms. The initial fee was $2, equivalent to approximately $35 today. Local residents and curious tourists began streaming through the entrance that had once admitted only the most privileged guests. The democratization of Biltmore had begun. The early years of public visitation brought modest returns, but established a precedent that would prove crucial to the estate's long-term survival. Visitors marveled at the scale and craftsmanship of the house. They wandered through rooms that newspapers had described for decades, but few ordinary citizens had ever imagined seeing in person. The word spread gradually that Biltmore offered an experience unlike anything else in America. World War II brought an unexpected chapter to Biltmore's history. Fearing enemy bombing of major cities, the National Gallery of Art sought a secure location to store its most valuable holdings. Biltmore's remote location and massive construction made it an ideal repository. Paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other old masters arrived in unmarked trucks and were stored in the basement and interior rooms. The priceless art remained at Biltmore throughout the war, protected by the very isolation that George Vanderbilt had sought when choosing his site. After the war ended and the artwork returned to Washington, Biltmore resumed its quiet existence as a tourist attraction. The Vanderbilt family maintained ownership, but struggled with the ongoing financial demands. The house required constant repair. The gardens needed tending. The roads and infrastructure demanded maintenance. Each year brought new challenges and new expenses. Survival remained uncertain, even as visitor numbers slowly grew. Cornelia Vanderbilt had married John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1924, and their sons would eventually take responsibility for the estate's management. But in the immediate post-war decades, the future remained clouded. Biltmore had survived through adaptation, transforming from private residence to public attraction. Whether this transformation would prove sufficient to ensure its permanent survival remained an open question. While Biltmore weathered its storms through public admission, Mar-a-Lago navigated an entirely different path. The Palm Beach estate would face its own trials in the decades ahead, trials that would lead it through government rejection and private acquisition to a destiny that Marjorie Merriweather Post had prophesied but never witnessed. Marjorie Merriweather Post presided over Mar-a-Lago for nearly half a century as Palm Beach's undisputed queen of hospitality. Her parties became the stuff of legend, events that combined her vast wealth with an instinct for entertaining that no amount of money alone could purchase. She earned the nickname the hostess with the mostest and spent decades proving that the title was richly deserved. The gold-leafed ceilings she had commissioned witnessed gatherings that brought together the most powerful and glamorous figures of the 20th century. The guest lists at Mar-a-Lago read like a catalog of mid-century achievement. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor attended regularly during their American visits. European royalty found the estate's theatrical grandeur appropriately regal for their standards. Hollywood stars mingled with Wall Street titans beneath the painted ceilings. Politicians from both parties sought invitations, understanding that Marjorie's favor could open doors throughout Washington society. Her dining table became one of the most sought-after destinations in American social life. Marjorie approached entertaining with the same business acumen she applied to managing her corporate interests. Every detail received her personal attention. The flower arrangements were planned weeks in advance. The menus were crafted to showcase the finest ingredients available from around the world. The guest lists were composed with careful attention to chemistry and conversation. She understood that a successful party required more than lavish spending. It required the invisible art of bringing the right people together in the right setting. The entertaining continued through her multiple marriages and divorces. Her second husband, E.F. Hutton, had been present for Mar-a-Lago's construction, but departed her life in 1935. Joseph Davies, a diplomat she married that same year, became her third husband. He served as ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Marjorie accompanied him to Moscow, where she acquired Russian imperial treasures that would eventually fill their Washington home. That marriage ended in 1955. Her fourth and final marriage to Herbert May in 1958 lasted only 6 years. Through all these personal upheavals, Mar-a-Lago remained her constant. The estate provided stability that her marriages could not. She returned to Palm Beach each winter season like a queen returning to her throne. The staff maintained the property in her absence, ensuring that everything would be perfect upon her arrival. The parties resumed each November and continued through April. Year after year, decade after decade, the ritual continued. Marjorie also used her wealth for significant philanthropy throughout these years. She funded hospitals and universities. She supported the arts with donations to museums and performance halls. The C.W. Post College on Long Island bore her father's name thanks to her generosity. Her charitable giving eventually totaled hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet her most ambitious philanthropic vision concerned Mar-a-Lago itself. From the estate's earliest days, Marjorie had harbored a dream that extended beyond her own lifetime. She believed that Mar-a-Lago should serve a national purpose after her death. The concept of a winter White House had guided her original construction decisions. She had built guest quarters capable of accommodating presidential security details. She had designed entertainment spaces suitable for state dinners. The estate's location offered obvious advantages for diplomatic meetings away from Washington's winter chill. Marjorie intended to donate Mar-a-Lago to the federal government as a presidential retreat. In 1973, as her health declined, Marjorie formalized this intention. She offered Mar-a-Lago to the United States government through the Department of the Interior. The gift came with funds intended to cover initial maintenance costs. She believed she was fulfilling the purpose for which she had created the estate nearly 50 years earlier. The government would gain a magnificent facility. Her creation would serve the nation in perpetuity. Everyone would benefit. On September 12, 1973, Marjorie Merriweather Post died at her Washington home. She was 86 years old and had lived one of the most remarkable lives in American history. The post-serial fortune she had inherited had become one of the largest privately held wealth concentrations in the nation. Her entertaining had shaped American social culture for half a century. Her philanthropy had benefited countless institutions and individuals. Now her greatest creation passed into government hands. The fairy tale should have ended there, but the federal government discovered that owning a Palm Beach palace was far more complicated than accepting one. The estimated annual maintenance costs approached $1 million, a figure that proved impossible to justify against competing budget priorities. Security expenses for a presidential facility would add millions more. The original endowment Marjorie had provided proved woefully insufficient for the actual demands of operating such a property. Congressional appropriators balked at funding what critics called an unnecessary luxury. The government held Mar-a-Lago for nearly a decade while these debates continued. Presidents Nixon and Carter showed little interest in using the facility. The maintenance costs mounted while the buildings deteriorated from inadequate care. The grounds that Marjorie had kept in meticulous condition grew increasingly neglected. By 1980, the government had decided to return Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation, essentially rejecting her gift. The Winter White House dream seemed definitively dead. The Post Foundation now faced the challenge of disposing of a property that consumed $3 million annually in maintenance costs. They placed Mar-a-Lago on the market in 1981 with an asking price of $20 million. The property languished. Unsold as potential buyers recognized the crushing financial burden that ownership would entail. The estate required massive investment merely to restore what years of neglect had damaged. Who could possibly afford such a white elephant? The answer arrived from an unexpected direction. Donald Trump, the brash New York real estate developer, had been eyeing Palm Beach properties as an expansion of his growing empire. He recognized in Mar-a-Lago an opportunity that others had dismissed. The negotiations stretched over several years, as Trump employed his characteristic tactics. He acquired the neighboring property and let it be known that he might build structures blocking Mar-a-Lago's ocean views. He waited patiently while the asking price dropped. In 1985, Trump purchased Mar-a-Lago for approximately $10 million, half the original asking price. The sale included the house, the grounds, and much of the original furnishing that Marjorie had collected over decades. Trump had acquired one of America's most significant historic properties for a fraction of its replacement value. He immediately began restoration work to repair the damage inflicted by years of governmental neglect. Trump initially used Mar-a-Lago as a private residence, spending winters in the estate as Marjorie once had. But the property's enormous costs posed the same challenge for him that they had posed for previous owners. Palm Beach property taxes alone exceeded $400,000 annually. The maintenance demands never ceased. Trump needed a revenue stream to make the property financially sustainable. His solution came in 1995 when he converted Mar-a-Lago into a private club. Members would pay initiation fees and annual dues for the privilege of using the estate's facilities. The club structure allowed Trump to maintain the property while spreading the costs across hundreds of wealthy members. It was a commercialization that would have appalled Marjorie Merriweather Post, yet it was also an adaptation that ensured the estate's survival. The conversion sparked immediate conflict with Palm Beach town authorities. Neighbors complained about noise from club events. Town officials questioned whether the club's activities were compatible with residential zoning. A complex legal battle ensued that would stretch over years. Trump eventually prevailed, though not without making concessions regarding operating hours and membership policies. Mar-a-Lago would continue as a club, its future secured through the very commercialization that traditionalists deplored. Both estates had now survived the 20th century through fundamental transformation. Biltmore had become a public attraction, democratizing access to Vanderbilt grandeur. Mar-a-Lago had become a private club, monetizing exclusivity to fund preservation. Neither outcome matched their founders' original visions, yet both outcomes ensured that the physical structures would endure into the 21st century and beyond. The question that remained was what role these transformed estates would play in modern America. Today, in the 21st century, both estates stand as monuments to American ambition, yet they serve fundamentally different purposes in American life. Biltmore has evolved into the most visited house museum in the United States, welcoming over 1.4 million guests annually through its grand entrance. Mar-a-Lago operates as an exclusive private club where membership requires $200,000 in initiation fees, plus $14,000 in annual dues. One estate democratized access to Gilded Age grandeur. The other monetized exclusivity to sustain Jazz Age fantasy. The contrast reveals much about the different paths American wealth can take when seeking immortality through architecture. Biltmore remains in the hands of George Vanderbilt's descendants, making it one of the few great American estates still controlled by the founding family. William A.V. Cecil, George's grandson, transformed the property into a sustainable business enterprise during the latter half of the 20th century. Cecil recognized that passive preservation would eventually bankrupt the estate. He expanded beyond simple house tours to create an integrated destination resort that could generate the revenues necessary for long-term survival. His vision transformed Biltmore from a struggling historic property into a thriving commercial enterprise. The estate now includes a winery that has become one of the most visited in America. Production exceeds 150,000 cases annually from grapes grown on estate vineyards. Tasting rooms and tours provide significant revenue while honoring George Vanderbilt's original interest in scientific agriculture. The winery operation employs dozens of workers and attracts visitors who might not otherwise tour a historic house. It represents exactly the kind of productive enterprise that George once imagined sustaining his mountain domain. Hotels and restaurants now operate on the estate grounds, allowing visitors to extend their experience beyond a single day. The Inn on Biltmore Estate offers luxury accommodations within the property boundaries. Village Hotel provides more accessible options for budget-conscious travelers. Multiple restaurants serve cuisine ranging from casual fare to fine dining experiences. These hospitality operations generate revenue while keeping visitors engaged with the property for longer periods. The overnight guests spend money throughout their extended stays. The numbers associated with modern Biltmore operations stagger those familiar with its history of financial struggle. The estate employs approximately 2,400 workers across all its operations. This workforce makes Biltmore one of the largest private employers in western North Carolina. Annual revenue approaches $200 million from combined tourism, hospitality, agricultural, and retail operations. The economic impact on the surrounding Asheville region exceeds $2 billion when indirect effects are calculated. Hotels, restaurants, and shops throughout the area benefit from visitors drawn primarily by Biltmore's presence. George Vanderbilt's estate has become the economic engine he originally intended, though through means he could never have anticipated. The scientific forestry program he pioneered eventually passed to federal management as Pisgah National Forest, but the remaining 8,000 acres continue generating economic activity through tourism rather than timber. The transformation required abandoning the self-contained manorial model George envisioned. Yet the underlying goal of regional economic development has been achieved beyond any reasonable projection. The house itself has been preserved with meticulous attention to historical accuracy throughout these commercial expansions. Visitors can walk through the same rooms where Gilded Age aristocrats once gathered for Christmas celebrations. The library still contains many of George's original 23,000 volumes, arranged on shelves he designed. The art collection includes works that hung on these walls more than a century ago. Period furnishings remain in rooms configured as they appeared during George and Edith's residence. Frederick Law Olmsted's gardens have been maintained and expanded according to his original vision. The approach road still winds through managed forest before revealing the chateau in the dramatic crescendo Olmsted designed. The formal gardens display seasonal plantings that change throughout the year. The conservatory nurtures exotic plants as it did when George supervised its operations. Visitors experience landscapes substantially similar to those Gilded Age guests encountered upon their arrivals. Biltmore achieved National Historic Landmark status in 1963 in recognition of its architectural and cultural significance. The designation acknowledges both Richard Morris Hunt's masterpiece and the estate's broader role in American history. The Biltmore Forest School's contribution to American conservation receives recognition alongside the architectural achievement. Preservation efforts receive support from tourism revenues, creating a virtuous cycle that sustains the property's future. The family ownership structure allows long-term planning that public or nonprofit ownership might not permit. The educational mission George Vanderbilt championed continues through modern programming adapted to contemporary audiences. School groups visit regularly to learn about Gilded Age history and architectural preservation techniques. Adult programs offer deeper engagement with specific aspects of the estate's history and operations. The property functions as a living classroom that honors George's scholarly vision while meeting current educational needs. Thousands of students annually discover American history through direct experience rather than textbook abstractions. Mar-a-Lago's contemporary role differs dramatically from Biltmore's public accessibility. The club remains off-limits to ordinary tourists regardless of their willingness to pay admission. Its interiors are visible only to those wealthy enough to afford membership or fortunate enough to receive guest invitations. Approximately 500 members enjoy access to the facilities Marjorie Merriweather Post created nearly a century ago. They swim in her pool, dine beneath her gold-leafed ceilings, and walk through gardens she designed for entertaining the elite. The exclusivity that defined Palm Beach society in Marjorie's era continues under the current ownership structure. Members pay not merely for access to historic architecture, but for association with fellow members of similar wealth and status. The club functions as a social institution as much as a recreational facility. Business deals are negotiated beside the pool. Social connections are forged at club dinners. The membership itself becomes a credential signifying achievement and acceptance among the American elite. The transformation that most dramatically distinguished Mar-a-Lago from Biltmore came with the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump's victory made his Palm Beach estate the de facto winter White House that Marjorie had originally envisioned. Presidents and prime ministers began arriving at the property for meetings and diplomatic events. The Secret Service established permanent security infrastructure. Mar-a-Lago appeared in news coverage around the world as a backdrop to presidential announcements and policy discussions. Marjorie's prophecy had finally been fulfilled, though through circumstances she could never have imagined. Foreign leaders, including Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Chinese President Xi Jinping, conducted diplomacy at Mar-a-Lago during the Trump administration. Summit meetings addressed issues ranging from trade negotiations to military threats. The estate's dining rooms witnessed conversations that shaped international relations. Whether this represented appropriate use of a private club for public business generated intense debate. Critics questioned the mixing of commercial operations with governmental functions at a facility where the president held financial interests. The political significance of Mar-a-Lago continues generating controversy that Biltmore has never faced. Legal proceedings have centered on documents stored at the property after the Trump presidency concluded. News cameras stationed outside the gates capture arrivals and departures that fuel endless speculation. The estate has become a symbol in American political discourse that transcends its architectural merits. Marjorie Merriweather Post sought to create a winter White House. She succeeded beyond imagination, though the results might have horrified her genteel sensibilities. Mar-a-Lago also holds National Historic Landmark designation, granted in 1980 in recognition of its architectural significance. The property represents the finest surviving example of the Mediterranean revival fantasy that once characterized Palm Beach development. Joseph Urban's theatrical interiors remain largely intact despite decades of changing ownership and use. The 36,000 antique Spanish tiles that Marjorie collected still adorn walls and floors throughout the estate. Preservation of these irreplaceable elements continues regardless of the controversy swirling around current ownership. The financial models sustaining each estate illuminate fundamentally different philosophies of cultural preservation. Biltmore operates as a heritage tourism business, generating revenue from millions of modest admission fees. This democratic approach allows anyone willing to purchase a ticket to experience Vanderbilt grandeur. The model requires constant attention to visitor experience and competitive market positioning. Success demands business sophistication that George Vanderbilt's scholarly temperament might have found distasteful. Mar-a-Lago's club model extracts larger payments from far fewer patrons. The initiation and membership fees fund maintenance without requiring mass visitation that would compromise exclusivity. This approach preserves the private atmosphere that defined the property throughout Marjorie's lifetime. It restricts access to those wealthy enough to afford membership. The estate remains a private playground for the elite, rather than a public resource accessible to ordinary citizens. Both properties face ongoing preservation challenges that test their respective models. Biltmore's limestone exterior requires constant attention to prevent deterioration. The massive roof needs periodic replacement at costs exceeding several $1,000,000. Interior preservation demands sophisticated climate control systems. Mar-a-Lago confronts similar challenges complicated by Florida's aggressive subtropical climate. Hurricane threats require extensive preparation. Salt air corrodes materials faster than mountain conditions affect Biltmore. The facts stand before us now, accumulated across more than a century of parallel history. Two estates, two fortunes, two competing visions of American grandeur. One opened its doors to the masses and built an empire on democratic accessibility. The other maintained aristocratic exclusivity and found preservation through restriction and political prominence. Both survived when countless comparable properties succumbed to demolition or decay. The question that has driven our inquiry from the beginning now demands an answer. What does power mean when measured against these twin monuments to American ambition? The question demands more than simple comparison of square footage or bank balances. Power takes many forms, and Biltmore and Mar-a-Lago excel in different dimensions of that multifaceted concept. To render a verdict, we must examine each dimension separately before attempting any synthesis. Only then can we honestly assess which empire proved more powerful across the century and more of their parallel existence. Consider first the dimension of architectural power. Biltmore wins decisively on scale and original craftsmanship. Its 178,126 square feet dwarf Mar-a-Lago's approximately 62,500 square feet by nearly 3-to-1. Richard Morris Hunt's French Renaissance design represents the pinnacle of Gilded Age architectural achievement in America. The coordination of house, gardens, and landscape that Hunt and Olmsted achieved has no American parallel. Frederick Law Olmsted called Biltmore his most challenging and rewarding commission. No serious architectural historian would rank Mar-a-Lago above Biltmore in terms of pure design achievement. Yet Mar-a-Lago possesses a theatrical power that Biltmore never attempted. Joseph Urban's fantastical interiors create an emotional impact that Hunt's scholarly elegance cannot match. The gold-leafed ceilings, the 36,000 antique tiles, the fusion of Spanish and Venetian and Moorish motifs produce an effect of overwhelming opulence. Visitors to Mar-a-Lago report feeling transported to a dream world. Biltmore impresses through its cultivation and refinement. Mar-a-Lago overwhelms through its theatrical excess. Both approaches represent valid expressions of architectural ambition, though they aim at entirely different targets. Consider next the dimension of economic power. Here, Biltmore's advantage becomes substantial and measurable. The estate generates approximately $200 million in annual revenue and contributes over $2 billion to the regional economy. It employs 2,400 workers directly and supports thousands more through indirect effects. The Vanderbilt descendants have built a sustainable business model that ensures the estate's perpetual survival. George Vanderbilt dreamed of creating an economic engine for Western North Carolina. His descendants achieved that dream through means he never imagined but would surely approve. Mar-a-Lago's economic impact remains far more concentrated and limited. The club employs approximately 500 workers and generates revenue from roughly 500 members. Its economic contribution to Palm Beach, while meaningful, cannot compare to Biltmore's regional dominance. The club model extracts wealth from members rather than creating broad economic activity. Trump's ownership preserved the estate, but did not transform it into an economic development engine. Mar-a-Lago remains a consumption of wealth rather than a generation of it. Consider the dimension of cultural power. Biltmore has shaped American understanding of the Gilded Age for nearly a century. Over 1.4 million visitors annually experience firsthand the scale of late 19th century wealth. School children learn history through tours of rooms where Vanderbilts once entertained. The estate has appeared in films, television programs, and countless publications as the definitive image of American aristocratic aspiration. Biltmore defines what we mean when we speak of Gilded Age grandeur. It has become a cultural touchstone recognized far beyond architectural circles. Mar-a-Lago's cultural power operates differently, but no less significantly. The estate has become one of the most recognized properties in the world through its association with presidential politics. Billions of people who will never visit Palm Beach have seen Mar-a-Lago on their television screens and phone displays. The property represents contemporary American wealth and power in ways Biltmore cannot match. It has become a symbol, though whether that symbol is positive or negative depends entirely on the observer's political perspective. Cultural power is not always comfortable or unifying. Consider the dimension of political power. Here, Mar-a-Lago achieves something Biltmore never approached. The estate has hosted sitting presidents, foreign leaders, and diplomatic negotiations that shaped international affairs. Marjorie Merriweather Post's vision of a winter White House has been realized in ways that exceeded even her ambitious imagination. Policy decisions affecting millions of people have been made within those gold-leafed walls. Whatever one thinks of the politics involved, the political significance is undeniable. Biltmore never sought such influence and never achieved it. George Vanderbilt showed little interest in political power during his lifetime. He engaged with progressive causes like scientific forestry and workers' welfare, but avoided partisan entanglements. His estate has remained similarly apolitical throughout its existence as a tourist destination. Visitors of all political persuasions can enjoy Biltmore without feeling that they are endorsing any particular ideology. This neutrality has served the estate well commercially, but it means Biltmore cannot claim political significance comparable to Mar-a-Lago's controversial prominence. Consider the dimension of survival power. Both estates have demonstrated remarkable resilience across more than a century of American history. They weathered the Great Depression when countless comparable properties were demolished. They survived world wars, economic recessions, and radical shifts in American social structure. They adapted to circumstances their founders never anticipated. They remain standing when so many of their contemporaries exist only in photographs and memories. This survival itself represents a form of power that deserves recognition. Biltmore survived through democratization, opening its doors to the public when private ownership became unsustainable. The decision required abandoning George Vanderbilt's vision of an exclusive private estate, but it ensured that future generations would experience his architectural achievement firsthand. Mar-a-Lago survived through privatization, converting from residence to club when governmental ownership proved impractical. The decision commercialized Marjorie Post's creation in ways she might have found distasteful, but it preserved the physical structure for future appreciation. Consider finally the dimension of prophetic power. Both founders articulated visions for their estates that extended beyond their own lifetimes. George Vanderbilt wanted to create a self-sustaining estate that would contribute to American culture and regional development. Marjorie Merriweather Post wanted to create a winter White House that would serve presidential purposes. Both dreams seemed extravagant or impossible during their lifetimes. Both dreams were ultimately fulfilled, though through pathways neither founder could have predicted. George Vanderbilt died, believing his estate might not survive him. The financial pressures seemed overwhelming. The scale of maintenance costs appeared unsustainable. Yet today, Biltmore thrives as exactly the cultural institution and economic engine he envisioned. His dream required adaptation, transformation, and commercial innovation. But the essential vision of a great American estate contributing to regional prosperity has been achieved. George Vanderbilt's prophetic vision proved accurate, even if the specific mechanisms differed from his expectations. Marjorie Merriweather Post died believing the government had rejected her gift, and her winter White House dream had failed. The federal government's return of Mar-a-Lago to her foundation seemed a definitive rejection. Yet decades later, presidents would indeed conduct business at her Palm Beach estate. World leaders would dine beneath her gold-leafed ceilings. Her prophecy was fulfilled through private ownership rather than governmental acceptance. The path was different, but the destination matched her original vision precisely. So which empire proved more powerful? The honest answer acknowledges that both estates represent different kinds of power, each impressive in its own dimension. Biltmore commands superior architectural achievement, economic impact, and cultural accessibility. Mar-a-Lago claims unprecedented political significance and worldwide name recognition in the contemporary moment. Biltmore has shaped American historical consciousness for a century. Mar-a-Lago has shaped American political discourse in the present day. If power means enduring contribution to American culture, Biltmore wins decisively. Its influence on architecture, forestry, tourism, and historical education spans more than a century of continuous operation. If power means contemporary political relevance, Mar-a-Lago claims a prominence that few private properties have ever achieved. Its role in presidential politics has made it globally recognized in ways Biltmore cannot match. Perhaps the truest answer recognizes that both estates represent the American capacity for grand ambition. George Vanderbilt and Marjorie Merriweather Post dreamed dreams that ordinary mortals would dismiss as impossible fantasies. They commanded resources sufficient to translate those dreams into stone and mortar. They created monuments that survived their creators and continue shaping American life generations later. That capacity for vision, execution, and endurance represents the deepest form of power that wealth can achieve. And so, as the sun sets over the Blue Ridge Mountains and rises over Palm Beach, two monuments to American ambition continue their vigil. Biltmore stands amid its mountain forests, welcoming millions who come to witness Gilded Age grandeur. Mar-a-Lago gleams beside the Atlantic, hosting those wealthy or powerful enough to pass through its gates. Both estates fulfilled their founders' dreams. Both survived challenges that destroyed countless comparable properties. Both will likely outlast everyone reading these words today. That is their truest power, the power of permanence in a world where most human creations prove fleeting. In the end, both empires won by simply enduring.